From being the friend who kept quiet to confronting the uncomfortable truth. How I stopped fixing his patterns, refused to be a rebound, and decided to protect my heart, even if it meant walking away. When I think back on how all of it started, the image that keeps coming up is her smile, the kind that made strangers relax and people talk like they'd known her for years. She had this effortless way of being around others. Quick with a laugh, generous with compliments, and the kind of small talk that somehow landed as something more. My friend fell for that first impression hard. I watched them, part advisor and part bystander, and I never stopped feeling a little off about her. Not because she screamed danger, but because something in that perfect sociability felt rehearsed, like a song played a few notes too many. I didn't mistrust her in a dramatic way. I stayed courteous, I kept things light, and I didn't let my friend see my hesitations. But instincts are sticky, they don't always announce themselves with fireworks. They live in the small, nagging details. A contradiction in a story, a reaction that didn't fit the moment, a way of steering attention back toward herself. Those little things flickered on and off, not constant, but enough to make me keep a polite distance. At first, everyone else seemed to buy the performance. For him, their closeness felt real fast, the kind of easy connection that convinces you it will last. I told myself to be patient. I listened when he talked about her like someone describing an impossible normality, and I offered quiet advice when he asked. But there was a part of me that kept thinking this was too good to be true. And it was. She pulled away without fanfare, without any clear explanation. For him, it was a hard landing, a wake-up from a dream he'd been building on his own. That break was the first crack, and it changed him in ways I hadn't expected. He grew more guarded, more brittle around the edges. The person who once trusted easily started putting up shields I didn't know how to breach. He began moving through people differently, as if testing how much of himself he could lose in the process. After that, he dated a lot. I don't mean casual text exchanges. I mean a string of short-lived relationships that didn't seem to touch him. Sometimes there were hookups. Sometimes dates that faded within weeks. He told me he was trying to find something that would matter, but mostly it looked like he was trying to escape the memory of what he'd lost. There was one relationship that looked like it might stick, but when it started feeling serious, something snapped and the other person pushed back hard. That hurt him more than he let on. Our friendship shifted, too. I understand what it's like to step back when someone is carrying around a storm. You don't want to add weight, and sometimes silence feels like kindness. So I accepted the distance for a while. But there were moments that made me uncomfortable, moments that felt like more than just changing dynamics. Small comments, a tone that didn't match the situation, a defensiveness that showed up when I mentioned my girlfriend. At first, I chalked it up to him being protective of his own wounds, but the pattern kept repeating. One night, he confided something that surprised me. He thought he might be bisexual. I didn't make a big deal of it. That wasn't the point for me. He was still the same person I'd known. But I did feel a small, unnameable prick at the idea that our friendship might be taking on new contours he hadn't explained. It wasn't rejection. It was more like seeing a map that had been folded in a way I didn't understand. As time went on, things became more awkward in group settings. He and my girlfriend generally got along, but there were times when he reacted strangely to her presence, or when mentions of plans would get an edge that wasn't there before. I let a few of those moments slide, thinking maybe he was having a bad day or didn't mean anything by it. Eventually, it stopped being something I could ignore. The comments became sharper and the silences louder. I tried to confront the tension gently. I didn't want drama, just clarity. I told him that certain remarks about my girlfriend felt out of place and that it was weird for him to change the story of their relationship when I'd always known it differently. He apologized in the moment, but then said things that made me question whether he was even aware of what he was doing. There were times when he portrayed the same people with different memories, as if rearranging facts to fit whatever version of the night suited him. That was confusing and, honestly, a little manipulative. What stung most, more than an insult or a careless comment, was the idea that I had to protect my boundaries while also telling myself I owed him compassion. I left for another city knowing I needed distance to avoid turning small fights into something worse. Before I left, I wanted to clear the air. I didn't want to vanish with unresolved things left behind. So we had a last talk where I explained that some of what he'd said about my girlfriend crossed a line, and that part of my moving away was about giving myself the space to prepare for the change without added drama. He said sorry. He said he hadn't thought. But then he added something that made it feel like a provocation, like he was trying to twist the whole conversation into a different shape. I shut it down because I wasn't interested in playing that game. There was also a night out when, in a haze of drinks and loud music, he called me a bad friend. Something I assumed was a drunken jab until the words kept circling back in my head. When I tried to talk, he brushed it off with a throwaway line that made it feel like he didn't want to face what he'd said. So I drew the line. I told him that things couldn't continue the way they had. Not because I hated him, not because I wanted to punish him, but because respect felt broken. I was clear, we were friends and that was the boundary. When I said it, I saw a flicker of hurt on his face. It was the kind of moment that confirmed something I'd suspected all along. There was something unspoken there, something he had never said directly but that the rest of us could feel in the room. After I left, I heard that he and that first girl were spending time together again. People told me they seemed close, like they were always around each other. I won't lie, at first I felt a weird twist in my chest, but not because of jealousy. It was more like recognizing that the story had folded back on itself in a way that made no one's part cleaner. If anything, it underscored how messy the whole thing had been from the start. I don't carry anger about any of it. What I feel is mainly a kind of pity. Pity for someone trying on different faces without finding the one that fits. I hope he finds a path that doesn't keep him floating from person to person, looking for an answer in someone else's eyes. I hope he chooses actions that match whatever words he finally decides to say. And I hope, selfishly maybe, that my choice to step back gives me the space to build relationships where trust and boundaries actually hold. There are still questions that sit with me. Why did she leave so suddenly? What did he feel and why did he never say it plainly? Could things have been different if someone had named the discomfort early on? I'm not writing this to indict anyone. More like to record what happened the way I remember it, because memory is messy and telling it helps me put my own pieces together. For now, I'm moving on, but that doesn't mean I don't carry the lessons. I'm learning to notice the small contradictions that matter and to trust the quiet alarms in my gut. Maybe someday we'll cross paths again, and maybe one of us will offer an apology that lands differently because time has taught us both something. Until then, this is the version that keeps me clear. I tried to be kind. I tried to keep my boundaries, and I learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for a friend is to step away when the pattern keeps repeating. It's not revenge. It's survival. I left partially to give us both space after the fallout. I tried to clear the air before I went, but there were still questions hanging between us. I noticed the change slowly, like a streetlight that begins to flicker before it finally goes dark. At first it was tiny things. A tone that didn't match his smile, excuses for plans that felt thin, a look that would drift off as if his mind were somewhere else. 3 weeks after she left, he started spending more evenings out. Not the familiar hangouts with friends, but a steady rotation of events where faces were new and conversations never dug deeper. It felt like he was trying to fill an absence by keeping the calendar full. One night he returned from a gathering and told me about an argument that had hit him harder than he expected. He spoke quietly, choosing words that made the moment sound less like a story and more like a bruise. He said he felt misread, surprised by someone's reaction, and that it made him pull inward. For days after, his humor was thinner. The quick rebounds I knew him for were absent. Where I used to be able to steer him back into lightness, he lingered in that quiet and carried it with him. In one of those smaller, private moments he said he thought he might be bisexual. He offered it cautiously, like testing a word to see how the air would hold it. I listened because that's what you do. You take in a friend naming a piece of themselves without turning it into a test. The admission didn't change who he was to me, but it shifted something subtle between us. Our routines stayed the same on the surface, but an undercurrent altered. There were now things he was trying to sort out that didn't have an easy place in the conversations we used to have. After that, the easy rhythm between us frayed. We still went to shows, we still messaged, but the pauses between sentences grew heavier. I started tracking behaviors not to judge but to understand. He'd praise someone in a group and then downplay their significance in private. He'd shrug off labels one moment and then react sharply the next time I mentioned my relationship. It looked like the weather inside him changed faster than his surroundings did, and he kept reshaping the story to fit whatever storm he felt that day. There was a night that kept replaying in my head. Crowded, loud, the kind of place where private things dissolve into music and chatter. In that place, he made a remark that landed like an accusation, half hidden in a laugh and swallowed by the noise. It was small in the moment, but it stuck with me because it revealed a pattern. Sharp words surfacing when the guard was down. When I asked him directly to stop making comments that undermined my relationship, I tried to frame it as a plea for clarity rather than a confrontation. He apologized sincerely, and for a moment we found a patch of common ground. But soon after, the narrative would shift again. He would offer a softened recollection of the same night or reframe the story in a way that left him less exposed. That retreat felt protective, like someone painting over a leak instead of fixing the pipe. The inconsistency wore on me because it meant we couldn't rely on the same memory of events. I missed the person who could take a joke and move on. Instead, I found myself balancing compassion with the need to protect my own emotional space. So I set a boundary. I told him I cared about him and wanted to support him, but I couldn't keep allowing remarks that disrespected my partner or that made shared memories malleable. I asked for honesty or at least consistency. I couldn't keep being part of a revolving door of shifting versions. Sometimes he softened and seemed to understand. Other times he circled back into arguments that justified his perspective. It felt like trying to hold water in a sieve. Every time I thought things would settle, they shifted again. That repetition is what finally made the relationship fragile in a way a single fight never had. Moving to the new city was both relief and grief. Relief because distance removed daily friction. Grief because I mourned the steadiness that had been lost. From afar I learned he'd been spending time again with that first person. It didn't shock me. Familiar paths do have a way of repeating themselves, but it made the loop feel strangely complete. Months later I check occasional updates and feel more sympathy than anger. Sympathy because it's clear he's trying different ways of being and hasn't landed on one that brings him peace. Sympathy because indecision and avoidance are heavy to carry. But sympathy doesn't mean erasing my lines. I can be present without being indispensable, and that distinction has become a rule I hold to rather than an emotional flourish. I still replay conversations sometimes and wonder if an earlier, clearer intervention would have moved things differently. The truth I keep returning to is simple. I spoke honestly, I set boundaries, and when the pattern didn't change, I stepped away. That choice felt necessary for my clarity and well-being. It wasn't a punishment. It was a preservation of the parts of me that I want to bring into future relationships. I left to create distance after our last talk, but before I went I tried to clear things up. He apologized, then said things that made me realize there were whole layers he hadn't named, and I couldn't carry the ambiguity anymore. I flew back for a weekend because something in my chest wouldn't let the story end on a half-answered note. Seeing him felt like opening a book to a middle chapter. Familiar lines but new margins where the handwriting had changed. We met in a cafe we used to go to, a place with 2 bright lights and a playlist that always ended up in nostalgia, and I decided to bring the things that had been looping in my head out into the open. I started plain. I told him I appreciated his apology months ago, but that the way he'd described things afterward had left me unsettled. I said I needed more honesty than convenient versions of the past. He listened with his hands folded, like someone holding a thin glass, and at first his face had the shape of contrition. Then, almost mid-sentence, he shifted. He said, "She's not my friend." And it landed like a word thrown to test the boundaries of the table. The phrase didn't match anything I remembered. It contradicted moments when he defended her or when I described how she'd stood up for him. The statement felt like a reset, an attempt to redraw lines after the fact. When I asked him what he meant, he pushed the idea away with a shrug that didn't meet my eyes. He spoke about people changing and not being the same, and then casually laced his words with a story where he repositioned himself from being betrayed to being the one hurt. It was baffling because the facts hadn't changed. Only his framing did. He seemed to be editing the narrative to reduce his exposure, to rewrite who had been close and who hadn't. It felt less like explanation and more like armor application. That moment made something click for me. I realized that, beneath the surface, there was a thread he had never been willing to pull on in front of me. The gaps between his apologies and his afterthoughts were where the truth had lived, or hadn't. I asked him directly whether what he'd said before, about thinking he might be bisexual, had anything to do with why he now framed relationships differently, or why he reacted the way he did around my girlfriend. He paused, and the pause was long enough to be a small confession. He apologized again, but this apology came wrapped in a line that felt like a step back. "When she was my friend," he said, as if that small clause made everything fit. It did the opposite. That conditional phrasing made me feel like I was watching him build a shelter from ambiguity. If she was his friend only at certain times, then maybe the rest of it becomes negotiable. I told him that memory isn't a menu you pick at whim. We've shared moments, and I remembered them one way. He tried to qualify things. His voice went low and quick, but the effect was the same. I found myself turning toward the part of the conversation that mattered most and asking him gently, "Did you ever feel something more for me?" He tried to redirect. He said he didn't want to hurt me, that he appreciated our friendship, and then, confusingly, he circled back to the way other people had treated him. Felt evasive. Then, much later in the conversation, he accused me of being a bad friend. A line he'd thrown at me during a night out that I dismissed as alcohol-fueled nonsense. Hearing it again, with less music and more intent, pushed me to name what I'd suspected. That maybe he had feelings he never confronted, and that those feelings had made him say things he later tried to erase or rewrite. Naming it changed the room. There was tension, yes, but there was also relief in turning a suspicion into a sentence. He didn't admit to everything. He didn't walk across the table and say, "I wanted you," in plain words. But in the smaller things, the way he deflected when I suggested I was moving on, the way he flinched when I described my plans with my girlfriend, the hesitant tone when he explained why he'd pulled away from the person who left, there was enough to see the contour of what he couldn't say. When I asked him why he'd called me a bad friend that night, he said something about projection and about fear of losing the safety of how we'd been. He said the words came out wrong and that the alcohol loosened edges he didn't want jagged in daylight. I told him I accepted the apology, but that acceptance didn't mean erasing the damage of patterns. The recurrent reframing, the sharp comments, the defensive shifts. I wanted an honest person across from me, not someone who sanitized memory to feel less vulnerable. He looked at me for a long time after that, and in his face I saw both shame and confusion. "I didn't want to make things complicated," he said. "I just got scared." That scared line was the most human thing he'd offered across the table, and it put me in a new place. Not anger, not absolution, but observation. I realized then that his avoidance was less about me and more about his inability to sit with needs that made him visible. He was trying versions of himself like outfits, and when one didn't fit or frightened him, he discarded it and tried another. We spent the rest of the day retracing small moments with the goal of aligning memory rather than proving who was right. I shared concrete examples where his words had shifted the facts and asked him to acknowledge how that felt on my end. He admitted that sometimes he reshaped nights to protect himself and that it was unfair. That admission mattered because it meant he could see the pattern when I pointed it out. It meant he could, potentially, choose otherwise. Before I left the city again, I told him clearly what I needed. Consistency, straightforwardness, and the space for both of us to be honest without rewriting events to make ourselves feel less exposed. I said that if he felt something more, he could say so, but that it wouldn't change the boundary I'd put around my relationship or the respect I expected. If he needed to figure himself out, I wouldn't be the half-step he used to avoid the work. It was a hard line, but necessary. In the weeks after, I watched from a distance. He reached out less frequently but with messages that were cleaner, without the sideways comments or flippant jabs. I don't know if that's because he was learning, or because distance made it easier to keep things simple. What I do know is that putting the question into words loosened the knot of ambiguity I'd been carrying. It didn't solve everything, and I don't think either of us expected it to. But it did clear a path forward. Honesty, at least, became an option we could try. I left with no illusion that everything would change overnight. People don't undo years of habit in a weekend. But I felt lighter. Not because the other person had been fixed, but because I had stopped carrying the task of repairing him alone. I had named my boundary, asked the hard question, and let the answer, or the lack of it, be part of how I would protect my own next chapter. I didn't expect the loop to close with a social media photo and a short caption, but that is exactly how it happened. One evening I was scrolling through updates, half paying attention, when an image made me stop. Him and her sitting together on a bench in a small park we used to walk through. Their heads were close, their posture relaxed, and the moment in the frame read as simple companionship rather than performance. There were no grand posts about reconciliation, no dramatic declarations. Just two people choosing to spend time together in a quiet way. For a moment I felt the reflexive rush of old feelings. Surprise, a small sting of jealousy, a flicker of wondering. Those emotions arrived honestly, but they didn't linger. Because distance had already done its work, the immediate heat cooled into something quieter. A clear-eyed curiosity and a measure of pity. Looking at them through a screen made it easier to see what I had suspected while standing inside the story. He had been trying on different ways of being, moving between people and situations as if searching for a shape that fit. It occurred to me that returning to someone familiar can be tempting for reasons that have nothing to do with healing. Familiarity offers easy warmth. It is less risky than slow change. Maybe he returned to her because the early warmth felt simpler than the harder work of naming what was missing. Maybe she offered something that felt like comfort in a season of uncertainty. I don't know their private motives, and I don't need to. The picture only clarified one thing for me. My chapter in that story had ended in the way I needed it to end. That realization was a relief more than anything else. The raw pain that followed our unraveling softened and rearranged into practical lessons. I stopped replaying every conversation to extract new injuries and started cataloging episodes for what they taught me. Each item in that mental catalog is now an early warning sign. Contradictions in how events are recalled, sudden reframings of the past, and comments that cross boundaries. Those are the things I promised myself I would notice earlier next time. One big lesson was about boundaries. Setting a boundary is not the same as shutting someone out. It is a decision about how much of your life you will offer to someone who is not acting consistently. I created boundaries because my patience had been turned into permission for him to avoid real work. The boundary was a practical tool to protect my energy and to prevent me from being the person who fills someone else's life while they refuse to look inward. It was an act of care for myself, not a punishment for him. Seeing him choose familiar company again made me reassess the kind of friend I want to be. I don't want to be the person who keeps rescuing someone in patterns that never change. That kind of persistence can become enabling if it is not paired with accountability. Instead, I want to be a friend who supports growth when it is requested, and who steps back when patterns repeat without effort to change. That balance preserves dignity for both people. I also found compassion growing in place of righteous anger. It's not that I excused what happened or minimized the hurt. It's that I could finally see his behavior as fear and avoidance rather than malice. People sometimes choose distraction over naming feelings because naming opens a door to vulnerability. Watching him cycle through temporary fixes made me feel sad more than furious. I hoped he would eventually choose steadiness over movement, honesty instead of avoidance. Practical changes followed that shift. I doubled down on habits that create stability. Clearer communication with my partner, social routines that nourish me, and friends who call me out when I make excuses. I stopped letting updates about him hijack my evening. Instead of letting a photo unsettle me, I would note it and move on. Keeping my life steady made it harder for old patterns to find a foothold in my present. I also started to require evidence for reconciliation. Words are easy. Consistent actions are not. If we ever met again and he said he had changed, I would listen. But I would also look for sustained signs that he had done the work. Small, steady acts that show accountability and a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than mask it. A single apology or a brief attempt at better behavior would not suffice. Real change shows up over time and in everyday choices. There is another kind of honesty I embraced. Acceptance that some chapters close without full closure. Not every relationship ends with a tidy conversation or public resolution. Some end because the people in them make different choices, and those choices finish the story with a quiet shift rather than a scene. The picture of them on a bench was one of those quiet endings. It did not settle everything, but it confirmed that life had moved on and that my role in that particular equation was done. I do not carry malice. I carry a pragmatic wish for him to find steadiness. I hope he learns to honor consistency instead of avoiding it, because that skill is kinder to everyone involved. If that steadiness includes being together, then I accept it as their choice. If it does not, I will not be surprised. Acceptance in this case is not surrender. It is a realistic stance that lets me invest my energy into relationships that match my values. I'm not closing the door completely. If he shows real, sustained change, not a dramatic apology or a fleeting attempt at being better, but consistent actions that align with honest words, I would consider rebuilding a friendship. That would require boundaries that are clear and respected, and it would require proof in daily behavior rather than a single moment of contrition. Accountability cannot be optional if connection is to be rebuilt. For now, I am moving forward. My life includes a partner who shares my values, friends who tell me the truth when I need it, and routines that help me stay present. I still replay scenes sometimes, but those replays are about learning rather than lamenting. They help me spot things early and act before a small issue becomes a recurring pattern. If we ever encounter each other again, I will listen and I will evaluate. I will not accept performative remorse as proof of change, but I will recognize genuine effort where it appears. If the person I once knew can commit to the steady work of being honest and consistent, I will consider reopening a door. If not, I will continue to wish him well from a distance, because letting go with compassion is its own kind of strength. The loop has closed enough for me to continue. The image that once could have felt like a provocation now reads as a simple fact. Two people spending time together. That observation freed me to invest in the life I wanted rather than the one I had been waiting on. I will keep the lessons, maintain my boundaries, and carry a cautious, open heart that prioritizes consistency and respect. That is how I will move forward. I remain open to an honest conversation if he ever shows the kind of sustained growth that signals real intention. That means clear steps, admitting past reframes, apologizing in ways that acknowledge harm rather than deflect, and following words with steady, small actions that rebuild trust over time. I would look for consistency rather than spectacle, accountability instead of excuses, and an ability to sit with uncomfortable feelings without rewriting them. Until then, I focus on my own steady work and relationships. Forward. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment. Thanks for your attention.